My name is Jessica Thompson, and I'm here to tell you about the day my family's greed cost them everything they thought they'd stolen from me. When my grandmother Eleanor passed away last spring, I thought the worst thing I'd face was losing the woman who raised me. I was wrong. The worst thing was discovering that the people I called family had been plotting to rob me blind while I grieved her loss. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. For 28 years, I believed blood meant something. I believed that when you love someone unconditionally, help them through their darkest moments, and show up every single time they need you, that loyalty gets returned. But sitting in that sterile law office in Riverside, watching my cousin Dylan laugh as he counted money that should have been mine, I learned that some people see kindness as weakness and love as an opportunity to take advantage. What they didn't know was that my grandmother had seen them coming from miles away. What they couldn't have predicted was that the woman who built a restaurant empire from nothing had outmaneuvered them at every turn. And what they definitely didn't expect was that the granddaughter they dismissed as naive would uncover every lie, every forged document, and every dollar they thought they'd hidden. By the time I was done, they'd learned that underestimating someone doesn't just make you wrong. It makes you broke, disgraced, and facing criminal charges. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because this story isn't just about greed and betrayal. It's about discovering that sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up giving you the strength you never knew you had. My grandmother Eleanor Martinez arrived in Riverside, California in 1952 with $47 in her pocket, a suitcase held together with rope, and a dream that seemed impossible for a young Mexican woman in post-war America. She didn't speak English well, didn't have connections, and didn't have anyone telling her she could succeed. What she had was something more valuable than all of those things combined. She had an unbreakable belief that hard work and smart planning could overcome any obstacle life threw at her. Eleanor started with a food cart outside the railroad station, serving breakfast burritos and coffee to workers heading to their shifts. She'd wake up at 4 in the morning to prep ingredients, spend 12 hours on her feet serving customers, then go home and count every penny she'd earned. She saved every dollar she didn't absolutely need to survive, and within 2 years, she'd saved enough to rent a tiny storefront on University Avenue. That storefront became Ellie's Kitchen, and Ellie's Kitchen became the heart of Riverside's downtown district. Eleanor didn't just serve food. She created a gathering place where families celebrated birthdays, where business deals were made over coffee, and where anyone who walked through her doors was treated like family. She learned English by talking to customers, improved her recipes by listening to feedback, and grew her business by treating every person who entered with genuine respect and care. By the time I was born, Ellie's Kitchen had grown into 3 locations across Riverside County. Eleanor owned the buildings, employed 46 people, and had become one of the most successful small business owners in the area. But success hadn't changed her. She still woke up before dawn, still personally checked every location, and still saved money like she was one paycheck away from losing everything. I spent every weekend of my childhood at my grandmother's house, a beautiful 1950s Spanish-style home in Riverside's historic district. The house sat on a tree-lined street with vintage street lamps, and every time I walked up the stone pathway to her front door, I felt like I was entering a sanctuary. Eleanor would greet me with the same words every Friday evening when my mother dropped me off: "Mija, you're home." Those weekends weren't vacations, they were education. Eleanor taught me how to balance a checkbook before I was 10 years old. She showed me how to negotiate with suppliers, how to read people's character and their body language, and how to plan for problems before they happened. While other kids were playing video games, I was learning the difference between revenue and profit, understanding why you never spend money you don't have, and discovering that real security comes from owning things that can't be taken away. Eleanor had a saying that she repeated so often it became like a family motto. "In life, Mija, you must plan for storms even when the sky is clear." She lived that philosophy every single day. While she enjoyed her success, she never forgot how quickly circumstances could change. She saved money obsessively, invested in real estate when prices were low, and collected valuable items that would hold their worth during uncertain times. That's how I learned about the gold certificates. When I was 12 years old, Eleanor showed me her collection of pre-1933 gold certificates, explaining that they'd been issued by the U.S. government before President Roosevelt banned private gold ownership. Each certificate represented actual gold that had been held in Federal Reserves, and because private citizens had been required to turn them in during the Great Depression, the certificates that survived had become incredibly valuable to collectors. Eleanor had acquired 47 of these certificates over the years, purchasing them whenever she found them at estate sale or through private collectors. She kept them in a climate-controlled storage unit, along with property deeds, insurance policies, and other important documents. But she also had copies made, and those copies she kept in a special hiding place that only I knew about. The hiding place was an ornate wooden jewelry box with mother-of-pearl inlay that sat on Eleanor's bedroom dresser. To anyone else, it looked like a normal jewelry box, about 8 inches by 6 inches, with a small brass key. But Eleanor had shown me something that no one else knew. If you pressed 3 specific spots on the inlay in the right sequence, a hidden compartment would slide open in the bottom of the box. Inside that compartment, Eleanor kept copies of the most important documents in her.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Collection, including photographs and authentication papers for each gold certificate. She taught me the sequence when I was 13, framing it as a game we played together. "Remember, Mija," she'd say as she showed me where to press, first the small shell by the corner, then the rose in the center, then the butterfly on the left side. Like a little dance your fingers do. We'd practice opening the secret compartment until I could do it with my eyes closed, and Eleanor would smile and say, "Good. Now you know how to find what's truly valuable, even when others see only ordinary things." I never thought much about why she was teaching me this. To me, it was just another one of the special things my grandmother and I shared, like how she taught me to make her famous salsa, or how she'd let me help count the day's receipts at the restaurant. Eleanor had always included me in aspects of her life that she kept private from the rest of the family, and I assumed it was simply because we spent so much time together. The rest of my family had a different relationship with Eleanor. My mother Patricia, who was Eleanor's daughter-in-law, had been married to Eleanor's son Miguel until I was 6 years old. When Miguel died in a construction accident, Patricia had struggled both emotionally and financially. Eleanor had helped support us, paying for our apartment and making sure I had everything I needed. But Patricia had always seemed resentful of having to depend on her former mother-in-law for assistance. Eleanor's biological son, my uncle Bob Martinez, had a complicated relationship with his mother's success. Bob had tried to start several businesses over the years, but none of them had succeeded the way Ellie's Kitchen had. He'd come to Eleanor regularly, for loans and investment money, and while she'd helped him when she could, she'd also been clear that her assistance came with expectations about how the money would be used. Bob's wife Carol had always seemed more interested in Eleanor's jewelry and antiques than in her wisdom or company, and their son Dylan had grown up assuming he'd inherit significant wealth without ever learning the work ethic that had created it. During family gatherings, I'd notice how differently they treated Eleanor compared to how I did. While I genuinely enjoyed her stories about building the business and learning about her investment strategies, they seemed to tolerate these conversations while waiting for her to discuss more immediate concerns, like who would inherit what when she was gone. They'd exchange glances when Eleanor talked about her latest real estate purchase or showed off a new addition to her antique collection, and I could tell they were mentally calculating what everything might be worth. As Eleanor got older, these dynamics became more pronounced. Bob and Carol started visiting more frequently, often bringing up topics like estate planning and whether Eleanor needed help managing her affairs. Patricia would make comments about how Eleanor was getting on in years and might benefit from having family members more involved in her business decisions. Dylan, who was 32 and still living with his parents, would hint about his own financial struggles and how he was hoping to start a business if he could just find the right investment opportunity. Eleanor was always polite during these conversations, but I could tell they made her uncomfortable. After family dinners, when it was just the two of us cleaning up in her kitchen, she'd sometimes make comments about people who count other people's money before those people are done using it. She'd remind me about the importance of earning what you have, and being suspicious of anyone who seemed more interested in your assets than in your well-being. 6 months before Eleanor passed away, she mentioned that she was updating her will and making sure all her important documents were properly organized. She'd been working with her longtime attorney, Helen Vasquez, to ensure that her wishes would be carried out exactly as she intended. Eleanor had always been meticulous about legal and financial matters, so I wasn't surprised that she was taking care of these details while she was still healthy and mentally sharp. What I didn't realize at the time was that Eleanor was also taking steps to protect her legacy from people she'd begun to suspect might try to manipulate the inheritance process. She'd started moving her most valuable documents and items to a secure storage facility, and she'd begun making copies of important papers that she kept in multiple locations. She was planning for the possibility that someone might try to interfere with her final wishes, and she was taking precautions to ensure that wouldn't be possible. 3 months before Eleanor died, I noticed that Bob, Carol, and Dylan had started visiting her even more frequently. They'd show up unannounced on weekday afternoons, often when they knew I was at work at the library and couldn't be there. Eleanor mentioned that they'd been asking a lot of questions about her business records, her safety deposit boxes, and where she kept important documents. They claimed they were worried about her and wanted to make sure she had help managing everything, but Eleanor seemed more annoyed than grateful for their sudden concern. During this same period, Eleanor started giving me small items that had belonged to her, saying she wanted to make sure I had them while she was still around to explain their significance. She gave me a necklace that had belonged to her mother, a set of wooden spoons she'd used when she first started cooking professionally, and several photographs from the early days of Ellie's kitchen. Each gift came with a story about its history and importance, and Eleanor would always end these conversations by reminding me that the most valuable things in life weren't necessarily the most expensive ones. 1 month before Eleanor passed away, she did something that seemed strange at the time but makes perfect sense now. She gave me the ornate jewelry box with the mother-of-pearl inlay, saying she wanted me to keep it safe for her. She didn't explain why she was giving it to me then, instead of waiting, and when I asked if everything was okay, she just smiled and said that sometimes it was important to move valuable things to places where they'd be protected from people who might not understand their true worth. I took the jewelry box home and placed it on my dresser in my small apartment above the used bookstore on University Avenue. I'd open it occasionally to look at the few pieces of jewelry Eleanor had left inside, but I didn't think to check the secret compartment. The jewelry box had become just another reminder of my grandmother's love and generosity, and I treasured it as a symbol of our special relationship, rather than thinking of it as a container for anything particularly valuable. 2 weeks before Eleanor died, she had what would turn out to be our last serious conversation. We were sitting on her back patio, watching the sunset over the mountains that surrounded Riverside, and she started talking about the future in a way that felt different from our usual discussions. She told me how proud she was of the woman I'd become, how much she appreciated that I'd always been genuinely interested in her stories and advice, and how confident she felt that I would make good decisions with whatever opportunities life presented to me. Then she said something that stuck with me. "Mija, remember that people will sometimes try to convince you that you don't deserve the good things that come your way. They'll tell you that you should be grateful for less than what you've earned, or that you should accept their version of what's fair. But you know your own worth, and you know the difference between what people say and what people do. Trust yourself, and don't let anyone make you small just because it makes them feel bigger." I thought she was giving me general life advice, the kind of wisdom that grandmothers pass down to help their granddaughters navigate adulthood. I didn't realize she was preparing me for a specific battle that she knew was coming. Eleanor had seen the way her family looked at her possessions, heard the way they talked about her estate when they thought she wasn't listening, and recognized the signs of people who were planning to take what didn't belong to them. When Eleanor died suddenly of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in April, I was devastated, but not entirely surprised. She'd been slowing down over the past year, and her doctor had been monitoring her heart condition. What did surprise me was how quickly the family dynamics shifted after her funeral. Within hours of the burial, Bob and Carol were at Eleanor's house, going through her belongings and making lists of items they wanted to preserve for the family. Dylan was asking questions about when the will would be read, and whether there were any immediate financial matters that needed to be addressed. Patricia, my mother, seemed caught between genuine grief and nervous anticipation. She'd loved Eleanor in her own way, but she'd also been struggling financially for years, and was clearly hoping that Eleanor's death would bring some relief from her money worries. She kept making comments about how Eleanor would have wanted the family to take care of each other, and how important it was that everyone be fair and reasonable during the estate process. I was too overwhelmed by grief to pay much attention to these conversations. I'd lost the most important person in my life, the woman who'd been more like a parent than a grandmother, and I was struggling to imagine what my future would look like without her guidance and support. The idea that there might be family conflicts over Eleanor's belongings seemed secondary to the much larger reality that she was gone and would never again be there to offer advice, share stories, or remind me that I was loved unconditionally. 1 week after the funeral, Bob called to tell me that the will reading had been scheduled for the following Monday afternoon. He said that Eleanor's attorney, Helen Vasquez, had set up the meeting and that all the beneficiaries needed to be present. The reading would take place at a law office downtown, and everyone should plan to arrive at 2 o'clock sharp. I was surprised that the will reading was happening so quickly, and I was also surprised that Helen Vasquez wanted to meet at a different office instead of her own. When I asked Bob about this, he explained that Helen was semi-retired and was working with a younger attorney, Thomas Bradley, who had a more convenient location downtown. This arrangement would make it easier for everyone to attend, and Helen would still be overseeing the process to ensure that everything was handled properly. This explanation seemed reasonable, and I was grateful that the family was taking care of the logistics during a time when I was still struggling with basic daily tasks. I trusted that Bob and Carol knew more about legal procedures than I did, and I assumed that Helen Vasquez would ensure that Eleanor's wishes were followed exactly as she'd intended. On the morning of the will reading, I chose my outfit carefully, selecting a black dress that Eleanor had complimented me on, and a small pearl necklace she'd given me for my college graduation. I wanted to look respectful and professional, honoring both Eleanor's memory and the importance of the occasion. I arrived at the law office 15 minutes early, taking the elevator to the 3rd floor, and finding myself in a sterile waiting room, with generic furniture and motivational posters on the walls. Bob, Carol, and Dylan were already there, and I was struck by how different their mood seemed from mine. While I felt somber and nervous, they seemed almost excited, talking quietly among themselves, and frequently checking their phones. Dylan was wearing an expensive-looking watch I'd never seen before, and Carol had a new handbag that looked like it cost more than I made in a month. When I asked about Patricia, Bob said she was running a few minutes late, but would be there soon. At exactly 2 o'clock, a man in his 40s introduced himself as Thomas Bradley and invited us into a conference room. He was professionally dressed and had the kind of confident demeanor I'd expected from someone handling Eleanor's estate. He explained that Helen Vasquez had been called away for a family emergency but had asked him to conduct the will reading on her behalf, following her detailed instructions about Eleanor's final wishes. Patricia arrived just as Thomas Bradley was arranging papers on the conference table, apologizing for her lateness and taking the empty chair beside me. She squeezed my hand and whispered that she knew this was difficult for me, but that Eleanor would have wanted us all to be together for this important moment. I appreciated her attempt at comfort, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the whole situation felt off in a way I couldn't quite identify. Thomas Bradley began by offering condolences and explaining that Eleanor had been very specific about how she wanted her estate distributed. He said that she'd updated her will recently and had been clear that her final wishes should be followed without modification or interpretation. He then began distributing sealed envelopes, explaining that Eleanor had prepared personalized messages for each beneficiary, along with information about their specific inheritance. Bob received a thick envelope that made him smile before he'd even opened it. Carol got an envelope that seemed to contain multiple documents, and Dylan's envelope appeared to be similarly substantial. Patricia's envelope was medium-sized, and she immediately began opening it with trembling hands. When Thomas Bradley handed me my envelope, I noticed that it felt different from the others. It was thicker in some ways, but also lighter, and when I held it up to the light, I could see that there was something bulky inside, rather than just papers. Thomas Bradley explained that Eleanor had left specific items for different family members, and that some envelopes contained keys or small personal effects along with inheritance information. I opened my envelope carefully, expecting to find documents explaining what Eleanor had left me along with perhaps a piece of jewelry or a personal note. Instead, I found a brass key attached to a small tag, and a single sheet of paper with a brief message. For Jessica, the jewelry box holds more than it appears. Remember what I taught you about finding treasure in ordinary places? That was it. No mention of money, property, or business assets. No explanation of what the key was for, or what I was supposed to do with it. Just a cryptic message about the jewelry box I already had, and a reminder about treasure in ordinary places. I looked around the room and realized that everyone else was reacting very differently to their envelopes. Bob was grinning as he read through multiple pages of documents, occasionally showing something to Carol that made her eyes widen with excitement. Dylan was actually laughing as he looked at papers that seemed to contain numbers and financial information. Patricia was crying, but they appeared to be tears of relief, rather than sadness. "I got the restaurant," Bob announced, holding up what appeared to be a property deed. "All 3 locations, plus the equipment, and the remaining inventory. The house and the land," Carol added, waving her own documents. 22 acres in the historic district, plus all the antiques and jewelry. Dylan was practically bouncing in his chair. "Investment accounts," he said, "stock portfolio, savings accounts, everything. There's almost $200,000 here." Patricia's voice was shaky with emotion as she read from her papers. The life insurance policy, $50,000, and her car, and her personal effects. They were all talking at once, comparing their inheritances, and expressing amazement at Eleanor's generosity. I sat there in silence, holding my brass key and reading my cryptic message over and over again, trying to understand what I was missing. "What did you get, Jess?" Dylan finally asked, and suddenly everyone was looking at me. I held up the key and the paper, feeling increasingly confused and embarrassed. "I think there might be some mistake," I said. "This just mentions the jewelry box I already have, and I don't know what this key is for." Thomas Bradley consulted his notes and shook his head. "No mistake," he said, professionally. "Eleanor was very specific about each bequest. She left you the jewelry box and its contents, along with whatever that key unlocks." "But what does the key unlock?" I asked. "I'm not privy to those details," Thomas Bradley replied. "Eleanor's instructions were simply to give you the key and the message." Bob leaned over to look at my paper, and I saw him exchange a glance with Carol that seemed almost like relief. "Well," he said carefully, "I'm sure Grandma had her reasons. Maybe there's something valuable in that jewelry box that you haven't discovered yet." Dylan laughed, but not in a mean way. "Come on, Jess, how valuable could an old jewelry box be? I mean, Grandma was great, but she was also getting pretty forgetful toward the end. Maybe she thought there was something in there that wasn't actually there." Carol nodded sympathetically. "These things happen with elderly people sometimes. They think they've put something somewhere important, but they actually moved it, or gave it away years ago. I'm sure she meant to leave you something substantial, honey." Patricia put her arm around my shoulders. "Sweetheart, don't take it personally. Your grandmother loved you so much. Sometimes older people just get confused about their possessions. The important thing is that you know how much you meant to her." Their words were meant to be comforting, but they made me feel worse instead of better. I knew Eleanor better than anyone in that room, and she had never been forgetful or confused about anything important. If she'd left me a key and a cryptic message, it was because she had a specific reason for doing so. But sitting in that sterile conference room, surrounded by family members, who were celebrating their substantial inheritances, while offering me sympathy for getting what appeared to be nothing, I began to doubt my own understanding of the situation. Thomas Bradley wrapped up the meeting by explaining that all the inheritances were effective immediately, and that the necessary paperwork would be filed with the appropriate authorities. He handed out business cards and said that anyone with questions about their inheritance should contact his office. As everyone gathered their things and prepared to leave, I noticed that Bob, Carol, and Dylan were making plans to meet at Eleanor's house to begin going through her belongings and deciding how to divide up the items that hadn't been specifically allocated in the will. "You should come too, Jess," Carol said, as we waited for the elevator. "I'm sure there are family photos and personal mementos that you'd like to have." I nodded and said I'd try to stop by later, but honestly, I felt too embarrassed and confused to want to spend more time with people who were now significantly wealthier, while I was apparently left with nothing but an old jewelry box and a mysterious key. I drove home to my small apartment, went straight to my bedroom, and sat on my bed, staring at the jewelry box that now represented my entire inheritance from the woman who had meant everything to me. For the first time since Eleanor's death, I felt truly alone. That evening, I sat in my tiny apartment, staring at the jewelry box, turning the brass key over and over in my hands. The sounds of traffic from University Avenue drifted through my windows, mixing with the usual clatter from the used bookstore downstairs as the owner closed up for the night. Everything felt surreal, like I was living in someone else's life, where the person who had loved me most had somehow forgotten I existed. I opened the jewelry box and looked at the few pieces of jewelry Eleanor had left inside over the years. There was a simple gold chain, a pair of pearl earrings, and a small silver bracelet, with a charm shaped like a butterfly. Beautiful pieces, but certainly nothing that would explain why Eleanor had made such a point of giving me the box, or why she'd left me such a cryptic message about finding treasure in ordinary places. The key was small and brass, with tiny numbers etched into the metal that I couldn't quite make out in the lamplight. It looked like it might fit a safety deposit box, or a small lock box, but I had no idea where such a container might be. Eleanor had never mentioned having a safety deposit box that she wanted me to access, and I'd never seen her use a key like this one during all the years I'd spent at her house. I tried to remember everything Eleanor had taught me about the jewelry box, going back to when I was 13, and she'd first shown me the secret compartment. The memory felt distant now, overlaid with years of other experiences, and dulled by grief. I could picture her fingers pressing specific spots on the mother-of-pearl inlay, but the exact sequence seemed just out of reach, like trying to remember a dream after waking up. For the first time in hours, I felt a spark of curiosity, instead of just sadness and confusion. Maybe Eleanor really had left me something valuable, something that required more than just opening the box and looking inside. Maybe the cryptic message wasn't evidence of confusion or forgetfulness, but rather a puzzle that only I was supposed to be able to solve. I picked up the jewelry box and held it under my bedside lamp, studying the intricate mother-of-pearl inlay that decorated the lid and sides. The design was beautiful and complex, featuring shells, roses, butterflies, and various other decorative elements, arranged in an elaborate pattern. I'd admired
This artwork hundreds of times over the years, but I'd never really examined it closely enough to memorize the exact placement of each element. I tried pressing different combinations of the decorative pieces, hoping that muscle memory would guide my fingers to the right sequence. I pressed shells and roses and butterflies in various orders, but nothing happened. The box remained stubbornly normal, showing no sign of the hidden compartment that I was increasingly convinced had to exist. After an hour of failed attempts, I set the box aside and tried to approach the problem more systematically. Eleanor had always been methodical in everything she did, from managing her restaurant business to organizing her personal belongings. If she'd created a puzzle for me to solve, she would have given me clues that made sense once I thought about them carefully. I reread her message for the 20th time: the jewelry box holds more than it appears. Remember what I taught you about finding treasure in ordinary places. The phrase about treasure in ordinary places had always been one of Eleanor's favorites. She'd used it when teaching me about investing, explaining how the most valuable opportunities were often hiding in plain sight. She'd said it when showing me how to identify quality antiques at garage sales, pointing out that real treasures were usually overlooked by people who only noticed flashy or obvious valuables. But she'd also said it in more personal contexts, like when she was teaching me about relationships and character. People show you who they really are in ordinary moments, Misha, she'd said. Not when they're trying to impress you or when they want something from you, but in the small everyday interactions when they think nobody important is watching. I wondered if the message about the jewelry box was meant to be interpreted the same way. Maybe the treasure wasn't hidden in some dramatically secret location, but rather in a place that seemed ordinary and unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what to look for. I picked up the box again and examined it from different angles, looking for anything that might seem ordinary but actually be significant. The base of the box was covered in the same rich wood as the rest of the piece, with a felt lining that looked original and undisturbed. The hinges were brass and appeared to be purely functional. The lock mechanism was simple and straightforward, operated by the small brass key that came with the box. Then I noticed something I'd never paid attention to before. The mother-of-pearl inlay wasn't uniform in thickness or color. Some pieces were slightly raised, while others sat flush with the wood surface. Some had a silvery sheen, while others appeared more golden or pink. I'd always assumed this variation was just the natural result of using genuine shell material, but now I wondered if it might be intentional. I started pressing the raised pieces in different combinations, beginning with the most prominent elements and working my way through less obvious options. Nothing happened for the first several attempts, but then I tried a sequence that felt familiar: a small shell near the corner of the lid, followed by a rose in the center, followed by a butterfly on the left side. As soon as I pressed the third element, I heard a soft click, and a section of the box's base slid open to reveal a hidden compartment about 2 inches deep and 4 inches square. My heart started racing as I realized that my childhood memories had been accurate after all. Eleanor really had taught me how to access a secret hiding place, and she really had intended for me to use that knowledge. Inside the hidden compartment, I found a manila envelope that had been folded to fit the small space. My hands were shaking as I carefully removed it and unfolded it on my bed. The envelope was sealed and had my name written on the outside in Eleanor's distinctive handwriting, along with a date from just 3 weeks before she died. I opened the envelope and found a letter written on Eleanor's personal stationery, along with several photographs and a small plastic bag containing what appeared to be keys and a folded piece of paper. The letter was 2 pages long, and as I began reading, I felt like I was hearing Eleanor's voice speaking directly to me from beyond the grave. "My dearest Jessica," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means that I was right to be worried about what would happen to my estate after I'm gone. It also means that you remembered what I taught you about the jewelry box, which gives me hope that you'll also remember the other lessons I tried to share with you over the years." The letter went on to explain that Eleanor had become increasingly concerned about her family's interest in her possessions during the months before her death. She'd noticed Bob and Carol asking detailed questions about her business assets, her real estate holdings, and her investment accounts. She'd observed Dylan making comments about expensive purchases he planned to make once his ship came in. She'd even heard Patricia on the phone with someone discussing how much Eleanor's house might be worth and whether it would need to be sold to divide the inheritance fairly among multiple beneficiaries. "I realized that they were all counting my money before I was finished using it," Eleanor wrote. "They were making plans based on assumptions about what I owed them rather than waiting to see what I chose to give them. This told me that they didn't really understand the difference between earning something and simply expecting it to be handed to you." Eleanor explained that she decided to test her family's character by creating a false will that would give them substantial inheritances while appearing to leave me with almost nothing. She wanted to see how they would react to the idea that I, the person who had shown the most genuine interest in her life and values, had supposedly been overlooked in favor of people who primarily viewed her as a source of financial opportunity. "I suspected that they would be relieved rather than outraged by this apparent injustice," Eleanor wrote. "I suspected that they would find ways to rationalize why you deserved less than they did, even though you had given me more genuine love and attention than all of them combined. If I was wrong about their character, they would have insisted that the will be investigated and corrected. If I was right, they would accept the unfairness without question because it benefited them." The letter went on to reveal that Eleanor's real will was completely different from the document that had been read at Thomas Bradley's office. In reality, Eleanor had left the restaurant properties to me along with her house, her investment accounts, and the majority of her personal possessions. Bob, Carol, Dylan, and Patricia were each designated to receive small monetary gifts and specific personal items, but the bulk of the estate was intended to go to the person Eleanor trusted most to honor her legacy and continue her values. "The will that was read today was a fake," Eleanor explained. "I had it prepared by someone who specializes in creating realistic-looking documents for testing purposes. The real will is in a safety deposit box at First National Bank of Riverside, along with all the supporting documentation you'll need to claim your actual inheritance. The key in this envelope will open that box, and the bank signature card that authorizes you to access it is already on file." My mind was reeling as I tried to process what I was reading. Eleanor had orchestrated an elaborate test of her family's character, and they had failed spectacularly. Instead of questioning why the person who had been closest to Eleanor had apparently been left out of her will, they had immediately accepted and celebrated an outcome that was fundamentally unjust. But even more shocking was the realization that I was actually Eleanor's primary beneficiary, inheriting assets worth potentially millions of dollars. The woman who had taught me about financial responsibility and long-term planning had entrusted me with the empire she'd built over 5 decades of hard work and careful decision-making. The photographs in the envelope showed the contents of the safety deposit box, including copies of property deeds, investment account statements, and business ownership documents. There were also pictures of Eleanor's most valuable collectibles, including her gold certificate collection that I'd learned about years earlier but hadn't thought about in relation to my inheritance. The folded paper in the plastic bag turned out to be a list of additional storage units and safety deposit boxes where Eleanor had placed various assets and important documents. She'd apparently spent months moving her most valuable possessions to secure locations where they couldn't be accessed or tampered with by family members who might try to influence the distribution of her estate. I know this seems complicated and perhaps unfair to the others. Eleanor's letter continued, but I've learned that fairness isn't about giving everyone the same thing. Fairness is about giving people what they've earned through their actions and character. You've earned my trust and respect through years of genuine love and attention. You've shown interest in my stories, my values, and my advice. You've treated me as a person worth knowing, not just as someone who might leave you money someday. Eleanor went on to explain that she'd chosen to use deception not out of cruelty but out of a desire to make sure her real will wouldn't be challenged or contested by family members who felt entitled to larger inheritances. By allowing them to believe they'd already received substantial gifts, she'd hoped to avoid the kind of legal battles that often tore families apart after someone died. If they had shown concern for you, if they had questioned why you seemed to be left out, I would have revealed the truth and divided my estate more evenly. Eleanor wrote, but their reaction will tell me everything I need to know about whether I made the right choice. If they celebrate their good fortune while ignoring your apparent misfortune, then they've shown me that they value money more than family, and they don't deserve to benefit from the work I've done to build security for the people I love. The letter concluded with specific instructions about how to proceed. I was to wait 1 week before taking any action, giving the family time to reveal their true character through their behavior after the fake will reading. After that week had passed, I was to contact Eleanor's real attorney, Helen Vasquez, using a phone number that Eleanor had included in the letter. Helen was aware of Eleanor's plan and was prepared to help me navigate the process of claiming my actual inheritance and dealing with the legal complexities that would arise when the truth was revealed. I'm sorry to put you through this deception, even temporarily. Eleanor's final paragraph read, but I wanted to make sure that my life's work would go to someone who truly understood its value. You've always been the light of my life, Mia, and I know you'll use what I'm leaving you to build something beautiful and meaningful. Don't let anyone convince you that you don't deserve what you've earned through your love and loyalty. And remember that the most important inheritance I'm giving you isn't money or property, but the knowledge that you are worthy of being loved and trusted completely. I set the letter down and sat in stunned silence for several minutes, trying to absorb the magnitude of what Eleanor had done. She'd created an elaborate test that revealed the truth about our family's priorities and character. She'd ensured that her real will couldn't be challenged or manipulated. And she'd found a way to give me not just financial security, but also the gift of absolute certainty about who I could trust and who I couldn't. The brass key that had seemed so mysterious a few hours earlier now represented access to a life-changing inheritance. The cryptic message that had left me feeling confused and abandoned was actually Eleanor's way of ensuring that only I could discover the truth about her real intentions. The jewelry box that had appeared to contain nothing but a few simple pieces of jewelry was actually the key to understanding that everything I'd been told about Eleanor's final wishes was a lie. I spent the rest of the night reading through all the documents Eleanor had left for me, studying the photographs of her assets and trying to understand the full scope of what she'd built over her lifetime. The restaurant properties alone were worth over $1 million, and her investment portfolio was even more substantial. The house and land where I'd spent so many happy weekends was now legally mine, along with all the antiques and collectibles that Eleanor had acquired over the years. But the gold certificate collection was perhaps the most significant asset of all. The photographs showed 47 certificates dating from the 1920s and 1930s, each one authenticated and appraised for insurance purposes. The total value of the collection was estimated at over $300,000, representing not just financial worth but also historical significance and rarity that would likely increase in value over time. As I looked at these images, I remembered Eleanor explaining to me years earlier why she'd chosen to collect these particular items. Gold certificates represented stability and security during uncertain times, she'd said. They were tangible proof that someone had planned ahead and made wise decisions about preserving wealth. They were also beautiful objects that could be appreciated for their artistry as well as their monetary value. Someday, Mia, Eleanor had told me when I was 15, you'll understand that the most valuable things aren't always the most obvious ones. The people who get rich quick usually lose their money just as fast, but the people who build wealth slowly and carefully create something that lasts for generations. Now I understood that Eleanor had been preparing me not just to appreciate her collection but to inherit it. She'd been teaching me about the patience and wisdom required to preserve wealth, because she'd always intended for me to be responsible for continuing her legacy. The week Eleanor had asked me to wait felt like the longest 7 days of my life. I went to work at the library every day, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy while processing the overwhelming knowledge that my entire life was about to change. I avoided my family's phone calls and declined their invitations to join them at Eleanor's house as they continued going through her belongings and making plans for their inheritances. Patricia called several times to check on how I was handling Eleanor's death and to update me on the family's activities. She mentioned that Bob and Carol were working with a real estate agent to get Eleanor's house appraised and that Dylan was meeting with financial advisors about how to invest his inheritance. Everyone seemed to be moving forward with their plans based on the fake will reading, showing no concern about the fact that I had apparently been left with almost nothing. "I know it's hard, sweetheart," Patricia said during one of our conversations, "but try not to take it personally. Your grandmother loved you very much, and I'm sure she just got confused about her final arrangements. The important thing is that the family is doing well, and everyone got something meaningful to remember her by." This conversation confirmed everything Eleanor had predicted about how the family would react. Instead of questioning an obviously unjust outcome, they were rationalizing it in ways that allowed them to feel good about benefiting from my apparent misfortune. They were prioritizing their own financial gain over basic fairness or family loyalty, exactly as Eleanor had suspected they would. By the end of the week, I was ready to contact Helen Vasquez and begin the process of revealing the truth. I was nervous about the confrontation that would inevitably follow, but I was also excited about the opportunity to honor Eleanor's real wishes and claim the inheritance she'd actually intended for me. On the morning I was supposed to call Helen, I received an unexpected visit that changed everything. I was getting ready for work when someone knocked on my apartment door. Through the peephole I could see a man in a dark suit carrying a briefcase, and my first thought was that he might be some kind of official investigator or legal representative. When I opened the door, he introduced himself as Marcus Rivera, and explained that he was an estate authentication specialist who had been hired to investigate irregularities in Eleanor Martinez's will. He said he'd been trying to locate me for several days and needed to discuss some important concerns about the validity of the will reading I'd attended. Marcus was probably in his mid-40s, with graying hair, and the kind of calm professional demeanor that suggested he dealt with complex legal situations on a regular basis. He asked if he could come inside to discuss the matter privately, explaining that what he had to tell me was sensitive and potentially shocking. "Miss Thompson," he said once we were seated in my small living room, "I have reason to believe that the will reading you attended last week was fraudulent. The attorney who conducted that reading, Thomas Bradley, doesn't appear to be licensed to practice law in California, and the will he read doesn't match the document that's on file with the probate court." I tried to look surprised by this information, even though Eleanor's letter had already explained the situation to me. I was curious to see how much Marcus knew about Eleanor's plan and whether he was aware that the fake will had been created intentionally. Marcus opened his briefcase and pulled out several documents, including what appeared to be official court filings and legal correspondence. "I've been hired by an interested party to investigate potential estate fraud," he explained. "There are significant discrepancies between the will that was read to you and your family and the will that was actually filed by Eleanor Martinez's legitimate attorney, Helen Vasquez." He showed me copies of documents that matched the information Eleanor had included in her letter to me. The real will named me as the primary beneficiary of Eleanor's estate, with Bob, Carol, Dylan, and Patricia receiving much smaller gifts than what they'd been told at the fake reading. "What this means," Marcus continued, "is that you are legally entitled to the majority of your grandmother's assets, including her business properties, her residence, and her investment accounts. The people who attended that will reading with you have been making plans based on false information, and they may be in possession of forged documents that have no legal validity." Marcus explained that he needed to verify my identity and ensure that I was prepared to claim my rightful inheritance before he could proceed with exposing the fraud. He asked if I had any documentation from Eleanor that might support my claim to be her intended primary beneficiary. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. I retrieved the jewelry box from my bedroom and showed Marcus how to access the hidden compartment. I handed him Eleanor's letter and watched as he read through her explanation of the elaborate test she'd designed for her family. Marcus's expression shifted from professional curiosity to amazement as he realized the sophistication of Eleanor's plan. "This is extraordinary," he said. "Your grandmother created a completely legal scenario for testing her family's character while protecting her real assets from potential challenges or manipulation. She was clearly a very intelligent and strategic woman." He explained that Eleanor's approach was unusual but not unprecedented. Some wealthy individuals had used similar tactics to ensure that their estates went to people who truly deserved them, rather than to people who simply felt entitled to inherit based on family relationships. What happens now? I asked, even though Eleanor's letter had already outlined the basic process. Marcus explained that he would need to coordinate with Helen Vasquez to begin the legal process of invalidating the fake will and implementing Eleanor's real intentions. The family members who had attended the fraudulent reading would need to be notified that their supposed inheritances were not legitimate, and they would be required to return any of Eleanor's assets they had already taken possession of. This is going to be a shock to them, Marcus warned me. People don't usually react well to discovering that money they thought they had isn't actually theirs. You should be prepared for some difficult conversations and possibly even legal challenges, although the documentation your grandmother left makes it very unlikely that any challenge would succeed. I told Marcus that I understood the situation might become complicated, but that I was committed to honoring Eleanor's real wishes regardless of how my family reacted. Eleanor had entrusted me with her life's work, and I wasn't going to let her down by avoiding conflict or accepting less than what she'd intended for me to receive. Marcus said he would contact Helen Vasquez that afternoon and begin the process of filing the necessary paperwork with the probate court. He estimated that it would take several days to complete all the legal requirements, but that Eleanor's real will would be officially recognized within a week. After that, he said, your family will be notified of the true situation, and you'll be able to take possession of your actual inheritance. Your grandmother planned this very carefully, Miss Thompson. She wanted to make sure you would be protected and that her real wishes couldn't be ignored or overruled. As Marcus gathered his documents and prepared to leave, he handed me his business card and said I should call him immediately if anyone in my family tried to pressure me or intimidate me once the truth was revealed. He said that estate fraud investigations sometimes led to desperate behavior from people who realized they were about to lose money they'd thought was theirs. After Marcus left, I sat in my apartment thinking about how dramatically my life was about to change. In a few days, I would go from being a librarian living paycheck to paycheck to being a wealthy woman with substantial business assets and investment accounts. I would own the house where I'd spent the happiest moments of my childhood, and I would be responsible for continuing the legacy that Eleanor had spent 50 years building. But even more significant than the financial change was the emotional vindication of knowing that Eleanor had trusted me more than anyone else in her life. She'd seen the same character flaws in our family that I'd been noticing for years, and she'd chosen to reward loyalty and genuine love, rather than simply dividing her assets equally among her relatives. The test Eleanor had designed had revealed truths about my family that I'd suspected but never wanted to acknowledge. They were capable of celebrating their own good fortune while ignoring obvious injustice to someone they claimed to care about. They were more interested in Eleanor's money than in Eleanor herself, and they were willing to rationalize unfairness as long as it benefited them personally. This knowledge was painful, but it was also liberating. I no longer had to wonder whether my family truly valued me as a person, or whether they saw me primarily as someone who might someday be useful to them. Eleanor's test had answered those questions definitively, and now I could make decisions about my relationships based on clear understanding rather than hopeful assumptions. As I prepared for bed that night, I opened the jewelry box one more time and looked at the hidden compartment that had revealed Eleanor's real intentions. The small space that had seemed so mysterious a week earlier now represented the beginning of a completely new chapter in my life. Eleanor had given me not just financial security, but also the gift of absolute clarity about who I could trust and who I couldn't. Tomorrow, Helen Vasquez would begin the process of implementing Eleanor's real will. Within days, my family would discover that everything they thought they knew about their inheritances was wrong, and I would finally be able to honor Eleanor's memory by using her gifts to build something meaningful and lasting. But tonight I simply felt grateful that the woman who had loved me most had also been wise enough to protect me from people who would have taken advantage of my grief and generosity. Eleanor had seen a storm coming, and she'd made sure I would have shelter when it arrived. The call from Helen Vasquez came at exactly 9 o'clock on Monday morning, 3 days after Marcus Rivera had visited my apartment. Her voice was warm but professional, carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades handling complex estate matters for wealthy clients in Riverside County. Jessica, dear, she said, I think it's time we had a proper conversation about your grandmother's actual wishes. Can you meet me at my office this afternoon? There are several documents you need to review, and we should discuss the timeline for implementing Eleanor's real will. Helen's office was located in a historic building downtown, with tall windows that looked out over the tree-lined streets of Riverside's business district. Unlike the sterile conference room where the fake will reading had taken place, Helen's office felt warm and established, with leather-bound legal books, family photographs, and certificates spanning 4 decades of legal practice. Helen herself was a woman in her 70s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that suggested she'd seen every possible variation of family drama during her long career. She greeted me with genuine warmth, explaining that she'd been Eleanor's attorney for over 20 years, and had watched me grow up through Eleanor's proud descriptions of my accomplishments and character. "Your grandmother talked about you constantly," Helen said as she poured coffee from an elegant silver service. "She was so proud of your dedication to education, your work ethic, and especially your genuine interest in her stories and advice. She used to say that you were the only person in the family who saw her as someone worth knowing, rather than just someone who might leave you money someday." Helen opened a thick file folder and began explaining the legal complexities of Eleanor's estate plan. The fake will that had been read by Thomas Bradley was actually a sophisticated test document that Eleanor had commissioned from a company that specialized in creating realistic legal props for educational and testing purposes. The document had no legal validity whatsoever, but it was convincing enough to fool people who weren't familiar with proper legal procedures and documentation. Eleanor came to me about 8 months ago with concerns about her family's growing interest in her assets, Helen explained. She'd noticed that conversations at family gatherings increasingly focused on her business properties, her investment accounts, and what would happen to various valuable items after she was gone. She felt like people were treating her more like a walking inheritance than like a person they genuinely cared about. Eleanor had decided to create a situation that would reveal her family's true priorities and character. She'd worked with Helen to draft a legitimate will that reflected her actual wishes, while simultaneously arranging for the creation of a fake will that would give substantial inheritances to family members who hadn't earned them, while appearing to leave almost nothing to the person who had shown the most genuine love and loyalty. The test was simple, Helen continued. If your family members questioned why you appeared to be left out, if they showed concern for obvious injustice, if they insisted that the will be investigated for errors, then Eleanor would have revealed the truth and revised her actual will to be more generous to everyone. But if they accepted the unfairness without question because it benefited them, then they would have proven that they valued money more than family relationships. Helen showed me copies of both wills side by side, and the contrast was stark. The fake will divided Eleanor's assets among Bob, Carol, Dylan, and Patricia in substantial amounts that totaled
nearly $2 million. The real will left each of them modest gifts of $5,000 plus specific personal items that had sentimental value, while designating me as the primary beneficiary of Eleanor's business empire, real estate holdings, investment accounts, and collectible assets. Eleanor's reasoning was very clear, Helen explained. She wanted her life's work to go to someone who had demonstrated genuine appreciation for her values and wisdom. She wanted to reward loyalty, kindness, and authentic relationship rather than simply dividing everything equally among people who happened to be related to her. The real will also included detailed instructions about how Eleanor wanted her business assets to be managed. Rather than simply liquidating everything and giving me cash, Eleanor had structured the inheritance to ensure that her restaurants could continue operating under my ownership if I chose to keep them running. She'd included recommendations about key employees who should be retained, suppliers who had proven reliable over the years, and expansion opportunities she'd been considering before her death. Your grandmother believed that you had the intelligence and character to continue building what she'd started, Helen said. She saw potential in you that she didn't see in other family members, and she wanted to give you the resources to create something meaningful with your life. Helen also explained that Eleanor had taken extensive precautions to ensure that her real will couldn't be challenged or overturned by family members who felt entitled to larger inheritances. She'd undergone comprehensive medical and psychological evaluations to document her mental competency at the time the will was signed. She'd created detailed video recordings explaining her reasoning for each bequest. And she'd moved her most valuable assets to secure locations where they couldn't be accessed or tampered with by people who might try to influence the estate distribution. Eleanor was extremely thorough, Helen said with obvious admiration. She anticipated every possible objection or challenge that might arise, and she created documentation that makes her intentions absolutely clear and legally unassailable. The safety deposit box at First National Bank contained not just Eleanor's gold certificate collection but also property deeds, business ownership documents, investment account records, and insurance policies worth a total of nearly $3 million.
Additional storage units held Eleanor's antique collections, family heirlooms, and business records dating back to the early days of Ellie's Kitchen. Helen handed me a comprehensive inventory of everything I was inheriting, and the scope of Eleanor's wealth was breathtaking. The 3 restaurant properties alone were valued at over $1.2 million, and they generated substantial monthly income that would provide ongoing financial security even if I chose not to actively manage the business operations. The house and 22 acres in Riverside's historic district were worth another $800,000, and Eleanor's investment portfolio included stocks, bonds, and mutual funds that had been carefully selected and managed over decades. But the gold certificate collection was perhaps the most impressive asset of all. Eleanor had been acquiring these rare documents for over 30 years, focusing specifically on certificates issued between 1928 and 1933 that represented the final years before private gold ownership was banned in the United States. The 47 certificates in her collection included some extremely rare varieties that were worth significantly more than their face value, with the total collection appraised at just over $400,000. Eleanor used to joke that the gold certificates were her insurance policy, Helen said. She said that paper money could become worthless during economic crises, but gold had maintained value throughout human history. She also loved the historical significance of owning documents that represented such a pivotal moment in American economic policy. Helen explained that Eleanor had continued adding to the collection even during her final months, purchasing 3 particularly rare certificates from a private collector who was liquidating his estate. These recent additions were among the most valuable items in the collection, representing Eleanor's continued confidence in her investment strategy even as she was making final arrangements for her own estate. As I reviewed the inventory and supporting documentation, I began to understand the full magnitude of what Eleanor had accomplished during her lifetime. She'd built a business empire that provided employment for dozens of people while serving thousands of customers. She'd accumulated substantial wealth through careful investing and strategic property acquisitions, and she'd created a legacy that could continue growing and benefiting others for generations to come. The question now, Helen said, is how you want to proceed with claiming your inheritance and dealing with the family situation. Eleanor's real will needs to be filed with the probate court, which will invalidate the fake will and officially transfer ownership of all these assets to you. But once that happens, your family members will discover that their supposed inheritances don't actually exist. Helen warned me that this revelation would likely create significant family conflict and possibly even legal challenges from people who felt they deserved more than what Eleanor had actually left them. While the documentation supporting Eleanor's real wishes was comprehensive and legally solid, that wouldn't necessarily prevent angry family members from hiring attorneys and attempting to contest the will. Estate disputes can become very ugly, Helen cautioned. People who thought they were getting substantial money often react poorly when they discover that's not the case. You should be prepared for accusations, manipulation attempts, and possibly even threats from people who feel like you've somehow cheated them out of what they thought was rightfully theirs. I told Helen that I understood the situation might become difficult, but that I was committed to honoring Eleanor's actual wishes regardless of how my family reacted. Eleanor had entrusted me with her life's work for good reasons, and I wasn't going to let her down by avoiding conflict or accepting less than what she'd intended for me to receive. Helen smiled at my response and said that Eleanor had predicted I would feel that way. She always said that you had the strength to stand up for what was right even when doing so was difficult or uncomfortable. She believed that you would protect her legacy and use her gifts wisely, and she was confident that you wouldn't be intimidated by people who tried to make you feel guilty for accepting what you'd earned through your loyalty and character. We spent the next hour reviewing the specific steps required to implement Eleanor's real will. Helen would file the necessary paperwork with the probate court the following morning, officially invalidating the fake will and beginning the process of transferring all assets to me. The court would issue notifications to all parties who had been named in the fake will, informing them that the document they'd relied on had no legal validity. Helen estimated that the entire process would take approximately 2 weeks to complete, during which time I would gain legal access to Eleanor's bank accounts, property titles, and business ownership documents. She recommended that I begin thinking about how I wanted to manage my new responsibilities, particularly regarding the restaurant business and the various real estate holdings. Eleanor left you much more than money, Helen explained. She left you a functioning business that provides livelihoods for many people, properties that contribute to the community, and investment assets that could continue growing if managed properly. You'll need to decide whether you want to maintain these operations, sell them, or perhaps expand them in new directions. Helen also suggested that I consider hiring professional management assistants, at least initially, to help navigate the complexities of suddenly owning substantial business assets. Eleanor had worked with a team of accountants, property managers, and business consultants who understood her operations and could provide continuity during the ownership transition. As our meeting concluded, Helen handed me a sealed envelope that Eleanor had left specifically for this moment. "She wanted you to have this after you learned about your real inheritance," Helen said. "She called it her final letter to you, separate from the instructions she left in the jewelry box." I waited until I was back in my apartment to open Eleanor's final letter. This message was more personal and emotional than the practical instructions she'd left in the hidden compartment, focusing on her hopes and dreams for how I would use the gifts she was giving me. "My dearest Jessica," the letter began, "by now you understand the scope of what I'm leaving you, and I hope you also understand why I chose to test our family's character before making my final decisions. You've proven once again that you're the person I believed you to be, someone who values relationships over money, someone who cares about justice more than personal benefit, and someone who has the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult." Eleanor wrote about her pride in watching me grow into an independent, thoughtful adult who had maintained strong values despite living in a world that often rewarded selfishness and materialism. She expressed confidence that I would use her gifts to create something meaningful and lasting, whether that meant continuing her business operations, pursuing new opportunities, or simply having the financial security to make choices based on my values rather than economic necessity. "I want you to know that this inheritance isn't charity or luck," Eleanor continued. "You've earned everything I'm giving you through years of genuine love, attention, and respect. You've listened to my stories, learned from my experiences, and shown interest in my wisdom. You've treated me as someone worth knowing, not just someone who might benefit you someday. That kind of authentic relationship is rare and precious, and it deserves to be rewarded." Eleanor also addressed the family conflict that she knew would arise once the truth was revealed. She encouraged me not to feel guilty about accepting what she'd chosen to give me, and not to be manipulated by people who would try to make me feel responsible for their disappointment or anger. "The people who are angry about your inheritance will try to convince you that you don't deserve what you're receiving," Eleanor wrote. "They'll say that family should share equally, that you're being greedy, that I wasn't thinking clearly when I made these decisions. But remember that they had no problem accepting substantial inheritances for themselves when they thought the fake will was real. Their objections aren't based on principles of fairness, they're based on the fact that fairness doesn't benefit them personally." The letter concluded with Eleanor's hopes for how I would use my inheritance to create positive change in the world. She encouraged me to think beyond my own immediate needs, and consider how the resources she was leaving could benefit others as well. "You have the opportunity to build something beautiful and meaningful," Eleanor wrote. "Whether that means expanding the restaurant business to provide more jobs, investing in community development projects, supporting educational initiatives, or pursuing your own dreams with financial security, I trust you to make choices that honor the values we've shared. The money and property I'm leaving you are just tools. What matters is how you use those tools to create value and meaning in your life and in the lives of others." As I finished reading Eleanor's final letter, I felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of both the gifts she was giving me and the responsibility that came with them. I was about to become a wealthy woman, with the freedom to make choices based on my values rather than financial constraints. But I was also about to become responsible for continuing a legacy that represented 5 decades of hard work, careful planning, and service to the community. The next morning, Helen Vasquez filed Eleanor's real will with the Riverside County Probate Court, officially beginning the process that would transfer ownership of nearly $3 million in assets to me. Within hours, the court issued notifications to all parties who had been named in the fake will, informing them that the document they'd relied on was legally invalid and that a different will was being implemented. I was at work at the library when the notifications were delivered, so I missed the initial reactions from my family members. But by the time I got home that evening, my phone was filled with voicemails and text messages that ranged from confused to panicked to furious. Bob had left 3 increasingly agitated voicemails demanding to know what was happening and insisting that there must be some kind of mistake. Carol had sent a series of text messages asking whether I knew anything about this crazy court notice and whether I'd hired a lawyer to challenge Eleanor's will. Dylan's messages were the most concerning, alternating between attempts at casual friendliness and barely concealed threats about what would happen if anyone tried to steal his inheritance. Patricia had driven to my apartment and was waiting outside when I arrived home from work. She looked exhausted and frightened, clutching a manila envelope that I assumed contained her notification from the court. "Jessica, honey, we need to talk," she said, as I climbed the stairs to my apartment. "Something very strange is happening with your grandmother's will, and I'm hoping you can help me understand what's going on." I invited Patricia inside and listened as she explained her understanding of the situation. According to the court notification, the will reading we'd attended was invalid, and a different will was being implemented that completely changed how Eleanor's estate would be distributed. "The notice says that you're inheriting almost everything," Patricia said, her voice trembling with emotion. "The restaurants, the house, the investment accounts, everything. It says that the rest of us are only getting small gifts instead of what we thought we were inheriting. There has to be some kind of mistake, right? Maybe someone is trying to defraud the estate or challenge your grandmother's real wishes." I could see that Patricia genuinely believed there had been an error, or that someone was attempting to manipulate the inheritance process. She hadn't yet considered the possibility that the will reading we'd attended might have been fake, or that Eleanor had deliberately created a situation to test our family's character. "Mom," I said carefully, "what if the will reading we attended wasn't legitimate? What if someone wanted to see how we'd react to an unfair distribution before revealing Eleanor's real wishes?" Patricia stared at me in confusion, clearly struggling to process what I was suggesting. "But why would anyone do that? And who would have the authority to create a fake will reading? That doesn't make any sense." I explained what I'd learned from Helen Vasquez about Eleanor's elaborate test, showing Patricia the letter Eleanor had left in the jewelry box's hidden compartment. As Patricia read Eleanor's explanation of her motivations and methods, her expression shifted from confusion to shock to something approaching horror. "She was testing us," Patricia whispered. "The woman I loved and respected for 30 years was secretly judging whether we deserved her money." I tried to help Patricia understand Eleanor's perspective, explaining that the test wasn't about judgment or punishment, but rather about ensuring that her life's work would go to someone who truly valued her wisdom and character rather than just her wealth. "But we did love her," Patricia protested. "Just because we were happy about inheriting money doesn't mean we didn't genuinely care about Eleanor as a person. Everyone thinks about practical matters when someone dies. That's normal human behavior, not evidence of bad character." Patricia's reaction was more thoughtful and less selfish than what I'd expected, and I found myself feeling sympathy for her confusion and disappointment. Unlike Bob, Carol, and Dylan, who had seemed primarily focused on their financial gains, Patricia appeared to be genuinely hurt by the suggestion that her love for Eleanor hadn't been authentic. "What happens now?" Patricia asked. "Are you really going to accept an inheritance that leaves the rest of us with almost nothing? Don't you think Eleanor would have wanted her estate divided more fairly among all her family members?" This was the conversation I'd been dreading but knew was inevitable. Patricia was asking me to voluntarily give up what Eleanor had chosen to leave me, based on arguments about fairness and family unity that sounded reasonable on the surface, but ignored the reality of what had happened during the fake will reading. "Mom," I said, "think about how everyone reacted when they thought I was getting almost nothing. Nobody questioned whether that was fair. Nobody suggested that the will should be investigated or challenged. Everyone was happy to accept substantial inheritances for themselves while I got essentially nothing, and the only explanation anyone offered was that Eleanor must have been confused or forgetful." Patricia was quiet for several minutes, and I could see her replaying the events of the will reading in her mind. When she finally spoke, her voice was subdued and thoughtful. "You're right," she admitted. "We were so excited about our own inheritances that we didn't really think about whether it was fair that you got left out. We just assumed that if we were benefiting, then Eleanor's wishes were being followed properly." Patricia asked whether there was any possibility of negotiating a different arrangement, perhaps by dividing Eleanor's estate more evenly among all family members regardless of what the real will specified. She suggested that such an arrangement would honor Eleanor's memory, while avoiding the family conflicts that would inevitably arise from implementing her actual wishes. I explained that Eleanor had anticipated this type of request and had structured her will in ways that made it legally impossible for me to redistribute assets without extensive court proceedings and tax consequences. More importantly, I told Patricia that voluntarily giving up what Eleanor had chosen to leave me would be disrespectful to Eleanor's memory and contrary to her explicit instructions. Eleanor spent months planning this situation, I said. She made deliberate choices based on her observations of our family's character and priorities. If I ignore her wishes and divide everything equally, I'd be saying that her judgment was wrong and that her values don't matter. As Patricia prepared to leave, she asked whether I thought Eleanor's test had been fair and whether I believed the results accurately reflected our family's true character. I think Eleanor saw something that I'd been noticing for years but didn't want to acknowledge, I replied. The way people treated her changed as she got older and wealthier. Conversations increasingly focused on her possessions rather than her experiences. People seemed more interested in what she could give them than in who she was as a person. Patricia nodded slowly, as if recognizing the truth in what I was saying. I suppose we did start taking her for granted, she admitted. We knew she was generous and successful, and maybe we started expecting that generosity instead of appreciating it. After Patricia left, I spent the evening thinking about the conversations that would be happening in other parts of my family as Bob, Carol, and Dylan processed the news that their expected inheritances weren't real. Unlike Patricia, who had shown at least some capacity for self-reflection and understanding, I suspected that the others would react with anger, denial, and attempts to challenge Eleanor's real will. The next few days would reveal whether my predictions about their character were accurate, and whether Eleanor's test had successfully identified the difference between people who genuinely loved her and people who had primarily valued her for what she could provide them. But regardless of how they reacted, I was committed to honoring Eleanor's wishes and accepting the responsibility she'd entrusted to me. She'd given me more than money or property. She'd given me the opportunity to continue building something meaningful and valuable. The least I could do was prove worthy of her trust by using her gifts wisely and refusing to be intimidated by people who valued wealth more than wisdom. Tomorrow Helen Vasquez would begin the process of transferring Eleanor's assets to my name, officially making me one of the wealthiest young women in Riverside County. But tonight, I simply felt grateful that the woman who had shaped my character had also given me the resources to live according to the values she'd taught me. Eleanor had planned for storms, and now I understood that she'd also given me shelter when those storms arrived. The explosion came on Thursday morning, when Bob, Carol, and Dylan showed up at my apartment together, their faces a mixture of rage and desperation that I'd never seen before. They'd clearly spent the previous days coordinating their response, and had decided that a united front would be more effective than individual attempts at persuasion or intimidation. Bob was carrying a thick folder of documents, and spoke with the kind of forced authority that suggested he'd appointed himself as the family spokesperson. Jessica, we need to resolve this situation immediately. This whole inheritance mess is tearing our family apart, and it's based on some kind of legal technicality that doesn't reflect what Eleanor really wanted. Carol was more direct in her approach, her voice sharp with barely controlled anger. Your grandmother was clearly manipulated by someone into changing her will at the last minute. Elderly people are vulnerable to influence from lawyers, financial advisors, and even family members who take advantage of their trust. We have grounds to challenge this whole arrangement. Dylan's contribution was the most revealing, because he made no attempt to hide his sense of entitlement or his fury at having his expected inheritance taken away. This is completely unfair, he said, his voice rising with each word. I was counting on that money. I've already made commitments based on what I thought I was inheriting. You can't just take that away from people without consequences. I listened to their arguments, without interrupting, studying their faces and body language as they presented their case for why Eleanor's real will should be ignored or overturned. Everything about their approach confirmed what Eleanor had predicted about their character and priorities. They were focused entirely on what they felt they deserved, with no consideration for what Eleanor had actually wanted or why she'd made the choices she had. Bob opened his folder and pulled out what appeared to be legal documents, explaining that they'd consulted with an attorney who specialized in elder law and estate disputes. According to this lawyer, there were several potential grounds for challenging Eleanor's will, including questions about her mental capacity, possible undue influence, and the unusual circumstances surrounding the fake will reading. Any reasonable court would find it suspicious that Eleanor created such an elaborate deception, Bob argued. People who are thinking clearly don't play games with their final wishes. they write straightforward wills that divide their assets fairly among their family members. This whole testing scenario suggests that Eleanor wasn't mentally competent when she made these decisions. Carol nodded vigorously and added her own interpretation of the legal situation. The fake will reading could actually work in our favor because it shows that Eleanor was confused about proper legal procedures. A legitimate attorney would never participate in such a scheme. The fact that Eleanor thought this was appropriate proves that she wasn't capable of making sound decisions about her estate. I found their arguments both predictable and disturbing because they were essentially trying to use Eleanor's intelligence and strategic thinking as evidence of mental incompetence. They couldn't accept that a sharp, successful businesswoman had outmaneuvered them, so they were reframing her sophisticated planning as confusion or manipulation by others. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" I said, finally breaking my silence. "Are you suggesting that I should voluntarily give up what Eleanor left me because you think her choices were unfair?" Dylan stepped forward, and I could see that he was struggling to control his temper. "We're suggesting that you do the right thing for this family. We're suggesting that you remember that these people raised you, supported you, and loved you long before you got greedy about some old lady's money." The phrase "some old lady's money" revealed everything I needed to know about Dylan's true feelings toward Eleanor. To him, she hadn't been a beloved grandmother whose wisdom and love had shaped multiple generations of our family. She'd been a source of potential wealth, and now that the wealth was going to someone else, he felt comfortable expressing his real opinion of her. Bob tried to take a more diplomatic approach, perhaps recognizing that Dylan's hostility wasn't helping their cause. "Jessica, we're not trying to take anything away from you. We're just suggesting that Eleanor's estate should be divided more equitably among all her family members. You could still receive a substantial inheritance, just not the overwhelming majority of everything she owned." Carol offered what she clearly thought was a reasonable compromise. "We could divide everything equally among the 4 families represented here. You'd still get hundreds of thousands of dollars, which is more money than most people see in a lifetime. But the rest of us wouldn't be left with nothing, after spending years caring for Eleanor and helping her with her business affairs." I found it interesting that Carol described their relationship with Eleanor as caring for her and helping with her business affairs, when my memories of their interactions were quite different. Bob had borrowed money from Eleanor repeatedly over the years, usually for failed business ventures that he'd never repaid. Carol had shown interest in Eleanor's antiques and jewelry, but had rarely demonstrated genuine concern for Eleanor's well-being or happiness. Dylan had treated family gatherings as obligations to endure, rather than opportunities to spend time with someone he valued. "Before I respond to your proposal," I said, "I'd like to understand something. When you thought the fake will was real, when you believed I was inheriting almost nothing while you were getting substantial amounts, how did that make you feel? Were you concerned about the fairness of that arrangement?" The question clearly made them uncomfortable, and they exchanged glances that suggested they'd anticipated this line of inquiry, but hadn't prepared a satisfactory response. Bob tried to deflect by claiming that they'd assumed the fake will reading represented Eleanor's actual wishes, and that they'd trusted the legal process to ensure fairness. "We thought that if Eleanor had left things that way, she must have had good reasons that we didn't understand. We weren't in a position to question her final decisions." Carol's explanation was even less convincing. "We were all grieving and trying to process losing Eleanor. We weren't really thinking clearly about the details of who got what. The important thing was honoring her memory and staying together as a family." Dylan's response was the most honest, even though it was also the most damaging to their case. "Look, if someone tells you you're inheriting a bunch of money, you don't immediately start questioning whether you deserve it. You feel grateful and excited, and you start making plans. That's human nature." I appreciated Dylan's candor because it revealed the fundamental difference between their priorities and mine. When they'd thought they were inheriting substantial wealth, their immediate response had been gratitude and excitement about the opportunities that money would create for them. They hadn't wondered whether the distribution was fair, whether I'd been treated justly, or whether Eleanor's apparent decisions reflected her true feelings about our respective relationships with her. "Here's what I find interesting," I said. "You're asking me to ignore Eleanor's actual wishes because you think her estate should be divided more fairly. But when you thought her wishes resulted in an unfair distribution that benefited you, none of you questioned whether that arrangement was appropriate." Bob tried to argue that the two situations were different because the fake will reading had seemed legitimate at the time while the real will appeared to be the result of manipulation or mental incompetence. But his argument fell apart when I pointed out that they'd had access to the same information I had about Eleanor's mental state and decision-making capacity in the months before her death. Eleanor was sharp and strategic until the day she died, I said. She was managing 3 restaurant locations, making investment decisions, and handling complex business affairs. The idea that she was somehow too confused to make rational choices about her estate is contradicted by every other aspect of her life during that period. Carol shifted tactics and tried to appeal to my emotions rather than my logic. Jessica, honey, think about what this is doing to our family. We're fighting over money instead of supporting each other through our grief. Eleanor wouldn't have wanted her death to cause this kind of conflict and resentment. This argument might have been more persuasive if Carol had shown similar concern for family harmony when she'd thought the inheritance arrangement favored her. But her sudden interest in avoiding conflict seemed directly related to the fact that the conflict no longer benefited her financially. Dylan's patience finally ran out completely, and he abandoned any pretense of diplomatic negotiation. You know what? This is ridiculous. You're being selfish and greedy, and you're hiding behind a dead woman's supposedly superior judgment to justify taking money that should be shared among the whole family. Eleanor was old and probably scared, and someone convinced her to make decisions that don't make sense. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where Eleanor had taught me to drive when I was 16, where we'd taken walks on summer evenings when I was in college, where she'd shared stories about building her business and overcoming challenges that seemed impossible at the time. Dylan, I said, turning back to face him. Eleanor wasn't scared or confused. She was disappointed. She was disappointed that people she'd loved and supported for decades were more interested in her money than in her wisdom. She was disappointed that family gatherings had become opportunities for people to hint about their financial needs rather than chances to genuinely connect with someone they claimed to care about. I explained that Eleanor had shared her concerns with me during our final conversations, describing how uncomfortable she'd become with the way certain family members treated her as they got older and her wealth became more obvious. She'd noticed that visits from Bob, Carol, and Dylan had increased in frequency as her health declined, but that these visits often involved conversations about estate planning, asset management, and what would happen to various valuable items after her death. She felt like she was being evaluated rather than visited, I said. Like people were taking inventory of her possessions instead of enjoying her company. That's why she decided to test whether anyone would speak up for fairness and justice when they thought those principles worked against their own interests. Bob's response revealed the depth of his sense of entitlement and his fundamental misunderstanding of what inheritance should represent. Eleanor owed it to her family to distribute her wealth fairly among the people who had been part of her life for decades. She didn't have the right to play favorites or punish people for being honest about their financial needs. The phrase Eleanor owed it to her family crystallized everything that was wrong with their perspective. They viewed Eleanor's estate as something they were entitled to receive, rather than as a gift that Eleanor had the right to give or withhold based on her own values and judgment. They saw her wealth as a family asset that should be divided equally, rather than as the product of her individual work and strategic thinking that she could allocate according to her own priorities. Carol made one final attempt at persuasion, this time trying to use guilt and family loyalty to change my mind. Jessica, if you go through with this, you'll be destroying relationships that have lasted your entire lifetime. Is any amount of money worth losing your family over? This question forced me to confront the most difficult aspect of the entire situation. By accepting Eleanor's inheritance and honoring her wishes, I would indeed be choosing money over family relationships. But the family relationships Carol was asking me to preserve had already been damaged by the way my relatives had reacted to the fake will reading. Their willingness to accept obvious injustice when it benefited them had revealed truths about their character that couldn't be undone by my willingness to share Eleanor's wealth with them. Carol, I said, I've already lost my family. I lost them the moment they celebrated inheriting substantial money while showing no concern for the fact that I'd apparently been left with nothing. I lost them when they rationalized obvious unfairness instead of questioning whether something might be wrong with the will reading. The money isn't destroying our relationships, it's just revealing what those relationships were really based on. After Bob, Carol, and Dylan left, I spent the rest of the day thinking about the choice I was facing. I could honor Eleanor's wishes and accept an inheritance that would give me financial security and the opportunity to continue building her legacy. Or I could ignore her explicit instructions and divide her estate more evenly, preserving family relationships but disrespecting the woman who had loved and trusted me most. The decision became clear when I remembered Eleanor's final letter and her encouragement to trust my own judgment even when others tried to make me feel guilty or selfish. She'd anticipated exactly this type of pressure and had warned me that people would try to manipulate me into giving up what I'd earned through loyalty and genuine affection. The next morning, I called Helen Vasquez and told her to proceed with implementing Eleanor's real will without any modifications or compromises. I also asked her to take whatever legal steps were necessary to protect the estate from challenges or interference by family members who felt entitled to larger inheritances. Helen wasn't surprised by my decision, explaining that Eleanor had predicted I would face pressure to redistribute her assets but had expressed confidence that I would ultimately choose to honor her actual wishes rather than succumb to guilt or family pressure. Eleanor knew that accepting her gift would require courage, Helen said. She knew that people would try to make you feel selfish for taking what she wanted to give you. But she also knew that you had the strength to do what was right even when it was difficult. The legal process of transferring Eleanor's assets proceeded smoothly over the following weeks, with each piece of property, each investment account, and each valuable collection officially transferred to my name. The restaurant properties came with existing management teams and established operational procedures, so the transition didn't disrupt the business or affect the employees who depended on those jobs. The gold certificate collection was moved from Eleanor's safety deposit box to a secure vault that I rented specifically for storing valuable collectibles. The 47 certificates represented not just financial value, but also a tangible connection to Eleanor's wisdom about planning for uncertain times and investing in assets that would maintain their worth regardless of economic conditions. The house where I'd spent so many happy weekends became my primary residence, and I converted Eleanor's home office into a space where I could manage the various business and investment activities that were now my responsibility. The transition from working as a librarian to managing a multi-million-dollar estate was overwhelming at times, but I found that Eleanor's years of informal education about business and finance had prepared me better than I'd realized. Bob, Carol, and Dylan did attempt to challenge Eleanor's will through the legal system, hiring an attorney who specialized in estate disputes and filing a formal contest based on claims of mental incompetence and undue influence. However, the extensive documentation Eleanor had created to support her decisions made their challenge unsuccessful. The video recordings Eleanor had made explaining her reasoning for each bequest were particularly compelling evidence of her mental clarity and strategic thinking. The medical evaluations documenting her cognitive abilities provided objective proof that she'd been fully competent at the time she'd signed her will. And the detailed written explanations of her concerns about family members' motivations demonstrated that her decisions had been based on careful observation rather than confusion or manipulation. The court dismissed the challenge within 6 months, ruling that Eleanor's will was valid and that her estate distribution reflected her clear and rational intentions. Bob, Carol, and Dylan were ordered to pay the legal costs associated with defending against their unsuccessful challenge, adding financial injury to the emotional disappointment of losing their expected inheritances. During this period, I had no contact with the family members who had challenged the will, but I did maintain a relationship with Patricia, who had chosen not to participate in the legal challenge. While she was disappointed about receiving a smaller inheritance than she'd expected, she'd come to understand and accept Eleanor's reasoning for her decisions. I realize now that we did take Eleanor for granted, Patricia told me during one of our conversations. We started seeing her as someone who would always be there to help us financially, rather than as someone we should appreciate for her own sake. I think her test revealed truths about our family that we didn't want to acknowledge. Patricia also helped me understand the broader impact of Eleanor's decisions on the family's social and financial situations. Bob had been forced to downsize his lifestyle significantly and had taken a job working for someone else's company rather than continuing to pursue his own failed business ventures. Carol had struggled with the social embarrassment of having to explain to friends and neighbors why their expected inheritance hadn't materialized. Dylan had moved back in with his parents and was working in food service, apparently for the first time in his adult life. While I felt some sympathy for their difficulties, I also recognized that these consequences were the natural result of their own choices and character flaws. They'd spent years living beyond their means based on assumptions about future inheritance rather than building their own financial security through work and saving. They treated Eleanor as a source of financial support rather than developing genuine relationships with her based on mutual respect and affection. Eleanor's estate had provided me with opportunities that I used to create value and meaning, rather than simply to accumulate wealth or status symbols. I kept the restaurant business operating and even expanded it by opening a fourth location that focused on catering and special events. I invested in real estate development projects that created affordable housing in Riverside's downtown area, and I established a scholarship fund for first-generation college students who were working their way through school while supporting their families. These activities honored Eleanor's legacy while also reflecting the values she'd taught me about using wealth responsibly and creating opportunities for others. The money and properties she'd left me weren't just personal assets, they were tools for continuing the work she'd started and building something meaningful that would benefit the community for generations to come. 5 years after Eleanor's death, I found myself sitting on the back patio of her house, which had become my house, watching the sunset over the mountains that surrounded Riverside. The restaurant business was thriving, the real estate investments were generating steady returns, and the scholarship fund had helped over 200 students complete their college educations. I thought about the choice Eleanor had offered me through her elaborate test, and I realized that she'd given me much more than money or property. She'd given me the opportunity to discover who I really was when faced with difficult decisions about family, fairness, and personal integrity. She'd shown me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable other people's selfishness and entitlement. The jewelry box with its hidden compartment sat on my bedroom dresser, still containing the few simple pieces of jewelry Eleanor had left inside, along with copies of the most important documents from her collection. Occasionally I would open the secret compartment and reread her letters, reminding myself of the lessons she'd taught me about planning for storms, finding treasure in ordinary places, and having the courage to stand up for what was right even when doing so was difficult or unpopular. Eleanor had known that her test would reveal uncomfortable truths about our family's priorities and character. She'd known that implementing her real wishes would create conflict and possibly destroy relationships that had lasted for decades. But she'd also known that preserving relationships based on money rather than genuine affection would ultimately be more destructive than the honest conflict that came from standing up for her values. Her final gift to me wasn't just financial security or business assets or valuable collectibles. It was the knowledge that I had the strength to honor the values we'd shared, even when doing so required me to stand alone against people who claimed to love me but were primarily interested in what I could give them. The family members who challenged Eleanor's will had eventually stopped trying to contact me, apparently accepting that their legal efforts had failed and that I wouldn't be persuaded to share my inheritance with them. I occasionally heard updates about their lives through Patricia, but we no longer had direct relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. This outcome was sad in some ways because it meant losing connections with people who had been part of my life since childhood. But it was also liberating because it freed me from the obligation to maintain relationships with people who valued money more than integrity and who were willing to rationalize injustice as long as it benefited them personally. Eleanor had taught me that family should be based on behavior rather than biology, and that the most important inheritance anyone can receive is the knowledge of their own worth and the courage to live according to their values. The gold certificates, the restaurant business, the real estate holdings, and the investment accounts were all just tools for building something meaningful. What really mattered was having the wisdom to use those tools in ways that honored the love and trust of the woman who had believed in me when others had given up. As I sat watching the sunset from Eleanor's patio, I felt grateful not just for the financial security she'd provided but for the clarity she'd given me about the difference between people who genuinely cared about my well-being and people who were primarily interested in what I could do for them. That knowledge was worth more than any amount of money, and it would guide my decisions for the rest of my life. Eleanor had planned for storms, and she'd also taught me how to find shelter when those storms arrived. But more importantly, she'd shown me how to build something strong enough to weather any storm, based on values that couldn't be shaken by greed, manipulation, or the disappointment of discovering that some people weren't who I'd hoped they were. The jewelry box had held more than gold certificates and important documents. It had held the keys to understanding who I really was and what I was capable of becoming when I had the courage to honor the lessons that truly mattered. 10 years had passed since that transformative day when I discovered Eleanor's hidden compartment, and the world looked completely different from where I now stood. The morning sun streamed through the windows of what had once been Eleanor's home office but was now the headquarters of the Martinez Foundation, named in honor of the woman whose wisdom had made everything possible. The foundation had grown beyond anything I could have imagined when I first inherited Eleanor's estate. What started as a simple scholarship program had evolved into a comprehensive initiative that provided educational opportunities, business mentorship, and community development resources throughout Riverside County. The original 3 restaurant locations had expanded to 12, creating over 300 jobs and becoming anchor businesses in neighborhoods that had struggled economically for decades. Marcus Rivera had become more than just the estate investigator who'd helped expose my family's fraud. He'd become a trusted advisor and eventually a close friend who understood the complexities of managing sudden wealth while maintaining personal integrity. His expertise in financial investigations had proven invaluable as the foundation grew and required sophisticated oversight to ensure that every dollar was used effectively and transparently. The gold certificate collection that had once seemed like Eleanor's personal insurance policy had become something much more significant. Rather than simply holding the certificates as static investments, I'd worked with historians and museum curators to create traveling exhibitions that taught people about economic history, the importance of financial planning, and the ways that government policies affect individual wealth and security. The exhibitions had visited over 50 schools and community centers, reaching thousands of students who might never have learned about these crucial aspects of American financial history. Patricia had remained the one family member with whom I maintained a genuine relationship, though even that connection had evolved significantly over the years. She'd eventually remarried and found happiness with someone who appreciated her for herself rather than for any potential financial benefits she might provide. Our conversations now focused on her new life, her volunteer work with local literacy programs, and her growing understanding of the lessons Eleanor had tried to teach our family about character and values. Bob, Carol, and Dylan had taken very different paths after their failed legal challenge. Bob had surprised everyone by using the adversity as motivation to finally build a successful business, though it was much smaller and more modest than the ventures he'd pursued when he'd expected Eleanor's money to finance his dreams. He'd started a handyman service that gradually grew into a small construction company, and while we didn't have a personal relationship, I'd heard through Patricia that he'd found satisfaction in earning his success rather than inheriting it. Carol had struggled more with the adjustment, particularly the social embarrassment of having to explain to friends and neighbors why her lifestyle had become significantly more modest than she'd planned. She'd eventually moved to another city where nobody knew about her family's inheritance disputes, and according to Patricia, she seemed to have found peace in a simpler life, focused on volunteering and community activities rather than accumulating status symbols. Dylan's journey had been the most dramatic transformation of all. The shock of losing his expected inheritance and being forced to find actual employment had initially sent him into a period of depression and resentment. But working in food service had eventually connected him with people who shared Eleanor's values about hard work, community service, and building something meaningful through dedication and persistence. He'd worked his way up to managing a restaurant in San Diego, and Patricia said he'd developed genuine respect for the industry that Eleanor had spent her lifetime building. The most surprising development had been a letter I'd received from Dylan 3 years earlier, in which he'd apologized for his behavior during the inheritance dispute and thanked me for not giving in to the family's pressure to ignore Eleanor's wishes. He'd written that losing his expected inheritance had been the best thing that ever happened to him because it had forced him to discover his own capabilities and develop his own sense of self-worth. While we still didn't have a personal relationship, his letter had provided closure to a painful chapter and confirmed that Eleanor's tough love approach had ultimately benefited even the people who'd resented it at the time. The jewelry box still occupied its place of honor on my bedroom dresser, though its contents had evolved over the years. In addition to Eleanor's original jewelry and the copies of important documents, I'd added items that represented the continuing story of her legacy: photographs from foundation events, letters from scholarship recipients, and small mementos from community projects that had been funded through her estate. I'd also added one new item that would have made Eleanor particularly proud: a letter from the mayor of Riverside recognizing the Martinez Foundation's contributions to economic development and community improvement. The foundation's work had helped revitalize 3 downtown districts, created affordable housing for over 200 families, and provided educational support for more than 800 students from low-income backgrounds. The secret compartment that had once held the key to exposing my family's true character now contained plans for the foundation's next major initiative, a business incubator program that would provide startup funding, mentorship, and resources for entrepreneurs from underrepresented communities. The program would focus particularly on food service businesses, honoring Eleanor's legacy while creating opportunities for people who shared her determination to build something meaningful through hard work and strategic thinking. Helen Vasquez had retired from active legal practice but remained involved with the foundation as a board member and advisor. Her decades of experience with estate planning and family dynamics had proven invaluable in helping me navigate the complexities of managing substantial wealth while maintaining personal relationships and community connections. She often reminded me that Eleanor had chosen wisely when she decided to entrust her legacy to someone who understood that money was a tool for creating positive change rather than simply a means of acquiring personal comfort and status. The most meaningful validation of Eleanor's decision had come from the people whose lives had been directly impacted by the Foundation's work. Former scholarship recipients had gone on to become teachers, doctors, engineers, and business owners who were now contributing to their communities and creating opportunities for others. Restaurant employees had been promoted to management positions and had used their experience to start their own businesses. Residents of the affordable housing projects had found stability that allowed them to pursue education and career advancement that would have been impossible without secure, affordable places to live. Each success story represented vindication of Eleanor's belief that investing in people's potential rather than simply giving them money created lasting positive change. The Foundation's approach emphasized education, mentorship, and long-term support rather than one-time financial assistance, reflecting Eleanor's understanding that sustainable improvement required developing people's capabilities rather than just addressing their immediate needs. As I reflected on the journey from that confusing will reading to the thriving foundation that now occupied much of my time and energy, I realized that Eleanor's greatest gift hadn't been the money or property she'd left me. It had been the confidence to trust my own judgment even when others tried to convince me that I was wrong, selfish, or ungrateful. She'd shown me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable other people's destructive behavior, even when that refusal causes short-term pain and conflict. The test Eleanor had designed had accomplished exactly what she'd intended. It had revealed the difference between people who genuinely cared about justice and fairness and people who only supported those principles when doing so benefited them personally. It had shown me who I could trust to support me during difficult times and who would abandon me the moment my choices didn't serve their interests. Most importantly, it had given me the opportunity to discover that I had the strength to stand alone when necessary and the wisdom to use that strength in service of values that mattered more than temporary comfort or popularity. Standing in the Foundation office that morning, surrounded by evidence of all the positive change that had grown from Eleanor's careful planning and strategic thinking, I felt profound gratitude for the woman who had seen potential in me that I hadn't recognized in myself. She'd given me not just financial resources, but also the knowledge that I was capable of using those resources to honor her memory while building something new and meaningful. The jewelry box would continue to hold its treasures, both visible and hidden, reminding me that the most valuable things in life often require patience, wisdom, and courage to discover. Eleanor had taught me to look beyond surface appearances and find treasure in ordinary places, and that lesson had guided every major decision I'd made in the decades since her death. Her legacy lived on not just in the foundation that bore her name, or in the businesses that continued to provide jobs and serve the community, but in the hundreds of lives that had been changed by her willingness to invest in character over convenience, in potential over immediate gratification, and in the belief that one person's commitment to doing what's right can create ripple effects that last for generations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.